So please put your hands together for Tom Morrod to kick things off.
I didn't get to pick my walk-on music. No one gave me that. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. It's like I only get the chance to do this a few times a year, so play along with me. My name's Tom Morrod. I'm from Caretta Research. We're a research and consulting company specializing in the media technology industry, and really happy to be here in front of all of you today. I'm going to talk through some thoughts on what it means to be a broadcaster in the future. So for those of you who are broadcasters, hands up. Let's do audience interaction for a couple of minutes. Oh, lovely. For some reason, you're all over that side of the room. That's bizarre. But anyway, these are my ideas on what has been happening and what might be happening. I've got 22 slides and 15 minutes, and Sam told me not to be late. So let's start. What does it mean to be a broadcaster in the streaming world? So my big points are going to be a lot of risk associated with being a broadcaster. You're losing control of your audience, your access, and your content in many cases. You're going to have to embrace new business models as everything transitions to streaming, and you're going to have to reposition your entire product strategy away from channels into something that will look more like an app environment. What's changing? Big picture, very conceptual. So control is the main thing that's kind of been shaken up over the last few years. Control of a TV used to be very much within the broadcaster realm. You switched on TV, you were straight on channel 1. That's not happening anymore, and that's causing broadcasters to need to look at different business models, change the economics, and ultimately change the product strategy, and look at different ways of positioning products and rolling together all of the products and services that they offer in order to try to regain that control. So this is all, I think, a big cycle about how to get away from losing control to streaming platforms and to device makers, and regaining control through repositioning products and economics. So let's talk a little bit about each of these, and we'll try and evidence some of the points. Streaming is, I'd say, gradually eroding linear viewing. It seemed to be happening pretty fast, but it's not as advanced as many of us might think. These are numbers from the UK. These are the Barb numbers. So about 20% or so of UK total viewing time is on streaming, and it's been slowly creeping up I've put ITV and BBC on here. Slowly creeping up from a handful of percent to a little bit above 10%. And so we can kind of extrapolate this trend that we're going to see more consumption on streaming. But I think it's also really important to frame this that most people still watch linear broadcast. That's most of the time spent consuming TV. But it's not necessarily going to be that way for very long. And also, when we talk about TV, we can very easily exclude other things that are video, like TikTok and YouTube and things like that. So we'll get to those in a moment. The TV experience has very fundamentally changed. So I remember, I'm old enough to remember, having a remote control that had like an up and a down button and channels 1, 2, 3, one of those little knobs. The environment that you're playing in when you switch on TV now is often controlled by the device maker. They look like this. It's very different to channel 1 and then changing to channel 2. The broadcaster doesn't control the TV experience anymore. The device maker increasingly does, or the platform that sits behind that. And so you risk losing control of first your access and your audience, but this, as we progress, moves from a zero-click experience getting you into linear TV to being subsumed into maybe a click-through into an app, or maybe into a channel aggregation in somebody else's app. So as a broadcaster, you're becoming somebody else's content rather than controlling the audience as they flow through the device and move around the device environment. We do still have, this is a bit of framing on the content side, we still have a lot of content that's created by broadcasters, but when we put that up against something like YouTube, and I haven't tried to do things like TikTok hours, we have vastly more content that you're competing with as well. Fun fact, 35,000 years of content are put onto YouTube each year. So if you started a at the extinction of the Neanderthals, you could watch all of the content that was uploaded to YouTube just last year. And you have to go back to the dawn of humanity to watch all of the content that is on YouTube now. So I think it's fair to say that none of us are going to do that. But as a broadcaster, you're again competing in this very bizarre environment where there is so much content. You're trying to drag attention and audience from basically infinite content, and that is just increasing. You couldn't watch all of the TikTok cat videos in a lifetime. So how do you retain visibility as you lose access? How do you make sure people know your brand? Broadcasters are some of the best brands in the world, especially in their own markets. How do you make sure that people can find your content? And how do you make sure that once they find your content and that they know your brand, you control the data and the experience as they're going through that consumption with you? So these are all kind of big questions that broadcasters need to answer, to work around. So let's talk about money. How do broadcasters make money? Linear advertising and various types of direct money coming in, either through carriage, content, or public funding. That's oversimplified, as I note, but it's kind of the way that most broadcasters make most of their money. However, all of the traditional forms of money coming into the industry, linear advertising, pay TV, those are all in decline, while this bigger random bucket of online stuff that includes many, many different things is rising. So you need to move away from a traditional business model and start collecting money from all of these other sources. So what does that look like? So we have movement away from, let's say, linear advertising towards non-linear and fast. We, of course, have to talk about fast. And a movement away from maybe direct income towards also picking up direct subscriptions. So these are different ways of collecting money in order to sustain an existing business model. But some of those are in decline, traditional ones, while some of them are rising. So we have about a 20% growth in non-linear advertising, AVOD. Fast is tiny, so we can talk about that separately. But this is mostly AVOD. And subscription services are, or online subscription is increasing, while linear advertising is in decline and all of the other kind of direct sources of income are in decline. So you have to shift your business model in order to pick up all of these new types of money. So what does that look like in terms of how do you position a product? So broadcasters are channels, traditionally. And that's not going to work anymore because you don't control the entry point onto the device. You don't control the way that people are navigating through channels. You have to reposition your brand to be a bit more of an umbrella. And we have this transition from what I'm terming sub-brands, which are basically all of the channels that exist, into a main centralizing aggregating brand. And I'm going to call them super apps because everything in this industry has to be super. But this is a really important, this is more than just a kind of repositioning of what people are doing kind of conceptually. This is an important different way of doing product management because instead of managing channels through playout, you start managing features and capabilities through basically a software platform. And this is this gives you loads of new capabilities because you can start pulling in all of these different monetization models, AVOD, BVOD, SVOD, TVOD, all of these different kind of VODs we've created. Basically different ways of making that money that we need to go out and reach. We need to find a way to put ads into streams and then change the ads in streams, play around with different ways of creating personalization of channels, play around with subscriptions versus ad-based. And all of this can be done in a single platform, which means that you don't have to create a business model and a justification and build a completely different tech stack in order to try each of the things that might work for you. So this approach is a product management. This is a different way of doing product management rather than running a variety of channels. So you can start looking at the benefit of features and capabilities within that platform. So I'm going to pick on fast again because we need to talk about fast constantly. The way that this particular feature is rolled out is not as a money-making mechanism. This is free marketing. And if you have to justify everything in terms of the return on investment, the cost of ownership and things like that, then it can be very easy to overlook certain ways and certain features. And this is a good example of where you might find a lot of benefit using FAST as something that maybe we're not thinking of at the moment. Looking for audience, looking for reach into difficult to find audiences, extending brands with new content. So there's a load of different ways that we can use technologies like FAST that are not directly making money. And we can start to address problems around monetization that are quite fundamental and, again, tech-related, because you can run everything through a single platform and you can start addressing these issues much more directly. This is the flow of money from an advertiser into the publisher, so, for example, a broadcaster. And if you run that through traditional channels, you would just have a sales team that would go out and ask the advertiser to give you the money. If you start running that through programmatic advertising, you have all of these tech players in the middle that start taking a slice. This is quite disruptive if your main money is coming from linear advertising, but if you're transitioning from linear to online advertising, this might be the way that you initially implement stuff. As soon as you start to run things more centrally, you can start to switch between these different business models a little bit more freely. So you could run your direct ad sales and start incorporating inventory that you have in ad replacement or on AVOD, and this means that you have more control of that environment. So this is all about retaining control, pulling back control through different ways of approaching product strategy and product management. And I think it's really important to put in context the regulatory framework here as well. Broadcasters exist in a highly regulated environment in pretty much every country in the world. And we have rules around things like must carry, which have been critical in building up the position of broadcasters. So what does that look like in a world of streaming and apps? How do we define must carry? I think the UK is in a really privileged position. We're way ahead of most of the world in actually addressing these issues, and there's legislation in play at the moment. So I think it's going to be critical for broadcasters to start being much more active in lobbying about how they want to be positioned in this world. We need to work with the regulators in order to help promote broadcasters as kind of critical infrastructure, as the local public services that they are right now, but allow that to exist in a world that they don't control the access and the audience anymore. We're also going to go through a huge technical transition, because as soon as you put all of the broadcaster content into an app, you don't need all of the digital terrestrial towers anymore. And I am old enough to remember analog switch off, and I'm just about to go through, I think, digital switch off. And we have a few countries in the world that have already started to plan this. What does public access look like in a world without public access terrestrial distribution? And so we have another issue to deal with, which is, again, a regulatory issue, but it will require quite a lot of work from the broadcasters and the regulators and governments in order to work out what we should do and how we should approach all of this. And then what does monetization look like when you've got all of these layers of device makers and platforms sitting between the broadcasters and the content and the audience and the viewers? So there's all of these different issues to work with. Who owns the data? How does the data flow? How much of this is, in the public goods? How much of this should be regulated? And how much of this is the kind of commercial free-for-all that we're living in at the moment? So what does the future look like overall? So there were some really good slides yesterday on devices and platforms. And I completely buy into the notion that device makers are going to essentially win the battle for consumer access. There'll be tons of consolidation. Matthew Bailey did a great presentation on that yesterday. There'll be, Walmart will buy Vizio, and that will drive huge consolidation in the way that we reach out to consumers. But broadcasters don't have to disappear in this world. They just have to migrate into a slightly different positioning. They need to be app first. They need to be streaming first. And they need to be supported by regulation that allows them to prioritize broadcasters as a critical channel for local content and local aggregation. Because that's the thing that's going to be overlooked in these global tech wars. What happens if you're trying to find out what's going on in the news in Croatia, for for example. If you're trying to get access to the Greek football and you live in Greece, which I do, is Netflix going to come and help there? Is YouTube going to help there? So I think there's this universe where we have to support the public value of broadcasters and do that as an industry and as governments and regulators to kind of balance off what's going to happen otherwise in these big global tech battles. And that's me done. Thank you very much for your time. I literally finished on the second.